the real reason you fear being alone will break you open, what if I told you that your fear of being alone has nothing to do with loneliness? Not really. What if the real fear isn't that no one will text back, or that no one will notice your absence, or that the world will go on without you? What if the real fear is that, in the silence of solitude, something ancient stirs inside you, something you've spent your whole life trying not to feel? We don't avoid being alone because we dislike quiet. We avoid being alone because we're terrified of what's waiting in it. And deep down, we know if we stop running, if we sit still long enough, something within us will break open. But here's the twist. That breaking isn't the end of you. It's the beginning of who you really are. You see, when we're surrounded by people, conversations, obligations, social media, and constant noise, it's easy to keep the mask on. The mask says, I'm fine. The mask says, I'm busy, important, needed. The mask tells a story you know isn't fully true, but you've rehearsed it so well that even you forget it's a performance. But when you're alone, truly alone, not just physically but psychologically, the mask starts to slip. And for most of us, that's terrifying. Because underneath that mask isn't just vulnerability, it's everything you've been avoiding. The grief you never processed, the dreams you buried, the anger you repressed, the love you never gave yourself permission to feel. Solitude is not a void, it's an amplifier. And when you enter it, your soul speaks louder than ever before.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more topics you love.
Think about this. When was the last time you sat in complete silence for more than a few minutes? No phone, no music, no podcast, no distractions. What happened? Maybe your thoughts got louder. Maybe your anxiety crept in. Maybe you started thinking about that one thing you said 5 years ago. That's not random. That's your mind detoxing from distraction. That's the emotional residue of a life lived on autopilot finally surfacing. And instead of facing it, we often escape back into people, back into productivity, back into performance. We run not because we're weak, but because we haven't been taught how to be with ourselves. And that's the real tragedy. Not that we're alone, but that we've never learned to trust our own company. Alan Watts once said, "You are under no obligation to be the same person you were 5 minutes ago." That idea is liberating in theory, but terrifying in practice. Because if you admit that your current identity is a construct, a choice, a costume, then you have to confront who you might be without it. Solitude forces that confrontation. It strips away the roles, the expectations, the social mirrors that reflect back who we think we are. And what's left? Just you. The raw, unfiltered reality of your being. No validation, no applause, just presence. And that's where the fear lives. Because in that space, you're not protected by the armor of identity. You're exposed. But here's where everything changes. That exposure isn't a punishment, it's an invitation. Being alone doesn't break you because you're fragile. It breaks you because you're ready. Ready to shed the parts of yourself that no longer serve you. Ready to stop pretending. Ready to meet the version of you that's been buried under years of noise, neglect, and fear. And yes, that breaking can feel like death, but it's the death of illusion, the death of the false self. And what remains isn't emptiness, it's truth. It's clarity. It's peace. Not the peace that comes from everything going right, but the peace that emerges when you've stopped running from yourself. So let me ask you something that no one else will. What are you afraid will surface if you were truly alone with yourself for a week? What emotion, what memory, what truth do you think might finally catch up to you? And here's the deeper question. What if facing that is the very thing that sets you free? The reason being alone feels like it might break you is because it will. but not in the way you think. Not into pieces, but into possibility. Not into collapse, but into expansion. Because when you stop trying to hold yourself together for everyone else, you realize you were never broken. You were just buried. And solitude is the tool that digs you out from under the rubble of identity, expectation, and fear. Being alone is not the absence of connection. It's the presence of real connection to yourself, to your source, to the quiet intelligence that has been whispering to you through every distraction. But you've been too busy to hear it. Now in the stillness, you finally can. And once you do, nothing is ever the same. A mirror of emptiness. Why solitude reflects the parts of you that relationships can't touch. Most of us spend our lives defined by our relationships. We are sons and daughters, lovers, friends, co-workers, mentors, enemies, followers, leaders. These roles are comforting. They give us a shape, a function, a place in the world. But here's the part we rarely confront. Every relationship, no matter how deep, shows us only part of ourselves. Because every person we interact with reflects back a version of us that is shaped by who they are, what they need, what they fear, what they desire. Even the most intimate bond is still a kind of mirror-distorted, partial, filtered. But solitude, true solitude, it's the only mirror that doesn't lie. When you're alone, there is no one to perform for, no one to impress, no one to blame, just you. Completely unfiltered, unmasked. And what you find there isn't always pretty, but it's real. We often say we want to find ourselves, but we search for that self through other people. We chase validation, connection, admiration, hoping that someone else will reflect back the version of us we long to believe in. But solitude doesn't give you that kind of comfort. It doesn't flatter your insecurities or feed your ego. It does something far more powerful. It shows you everything you are when no one's watching. It reveals the habits you've built, the emotions you've buried, the patterns you repeat when no one else is around to distract you from yourself. And in that raw reflection, a deeper truth emerges. You begin to see how much of your identity was designed for the eyes of others. This is why solitude is so difficult for most of us. It's not because we lack company. It's because we've never learned how to be seen by ourselves. We've outsourced our self-image to relationships. We don't know who we are unless someone else is there to confirm it. But this dependency keeps us blind to our own depth. It keeps us circling the surface of life, chasing connection without ever truly knowing connection to our own being. Solitude breaks that pattern. It calls us inward. And when we answer that call, we don't just find isolation, we find intimacy, the kind that no relationship, no friendship, no applause can ever replicate. Alan Watts once said, "The more a thing tends to be permanent, the more it tends to be lifeless." And when we try to make ourselves permanent through relationships by being the good partner, the reliable friend, the successful person, we become rigid, predictable. We live in roles instead of reality. But solitude disrupts that permanence. It dissolves the scripts we've internalized. It invites us to become fluid again, to remember that we are not fixed identities, but living, breathing consciousness that is always becoming. And in that space of becoming, we encounter parts of ourselves we didn't even know existed. Have you ever noticed how certain thoughts only come to you when you're alone for long stretches of time? Not the surface level worries, but the deep insights. The kind of thoughts that shift your entire perspective. That's because solitude isn't just about being away from people, it's about creating the mental and emotional stillness where your deeper intelligence can rise. It's not that truth doesn't speak when you're with others, it's that the signal gets drowned out by the noise of social performance. So here's a question to sit with. What version of you exists only when no one else is around? Who are you when there's no one left to impress, no one to respond to, no one to depend on for a reflection of yourself? That version, that quiet, uncertain, vulnerable, mysterious presence is the real you. Not the identity shaped by others, but the awareness beneath it all. And solitude is the only way to meet that version face to face. You won't always like what you see. You might find grief, old wounds, insecurity, even rage, but you'll also find clarity. You'll find softness. You'll find a strength that doesn't come from being tough, but from being true. And you'll realize something staggering. You've spent your whole life trying to be known by others, but you've barely scratched the surface of knowing yourself. Solitude is the mirror that shows you what relationships can't. It doesn't reflect who you are to the world, it reflects who you are without it. And in that reflection, you don't just see yourself more clearly. You begin to feel your own presence, not as a role, not as an image, but as something infinitely deeper. The collapse of the false self. Why aloneness is the doorway to absolute freedom. There's a moment in every true encounter with solitude when something inside you begins to crack, not from pressure, not from sadness, but from the unbearable weight of inauthenticity. You start to feel the layers peel away, the need to be liked, the need to be understood, the need to constantly explain yourself. And as each layer falls, something becomes terrifyingly clear. Most of who you thought you were was never you. It was built, inherited, constructed to survive, to belong, to succeed, but not to be. And this realization doesn't come gently. It comes like an earthquake. It feels like a collapse. But it's not the collapse of yourself, it's the collapse of your false self. The one you've performed your entire life to protect yourself from rejection, pain, and fear. And when it begins to fall, you finally get a glimpse of something you've never truly known. Not the kind of freedom we usually chase, the freedom to travel, to make choices, to earn more, to live how we want. That's external freedom, and while it has its place, it's still tethered to circumstance. The freedom I'm talking about is internal. It's the freedom to exist without justification. The freedom to drop the mask and not fear what's underneath. The freedom to be unliked, misunderstood, even forgotten and still feel whole. That kind of freedom doesn't come from success or validation. It comes from aloneness, from sitting with yourself long enough to realize that the person you've been trying to prove something to your whole life was you. And here's the paradox. The more you try to avoid being alone, the more you strengthen the false self. Because the false self needs others to survive. It feeds on reaction, reputation, and reflection. It needs to be seen, to be praised, to be admired. But your real self, it doesn't need anything. It just is. It's silent. It's still. It's aware. And it doesn't panic when no one's around. It doesn't spiral when there's no attention. It doesn't collapse when no one cares. Because it's not a performance. It's a presence. In solitude, you start to notice how much of your behavior has been driven by fear, not just fear of being alone, but fear of being unseen, unneeded, unimportant. And when that fear is stripped away, what's left is something rare. Stillness. And from that stillness comes clarity. You begin to ask different questions. Not, how do I get them to like me? But why do I need their approval in the first place? Not, what should I do to be impressive? But what do I truly want when no one's watching? And perhaps the most terrifying question of all, if I stop proving my worth, would I still have any? Sit with that. Let it echo. Because until you face that question, you'll keep building your life on a foundation that isn't yours. You'll keep chasing goals that aren't yours. You'll keep molding yourself into shapes that fit someone else's vision of success, love, and meaning. And you'll wonder why, even when you get what you thought you wanted, you still feel hollow inside. That hollowness isn't failure. It's feedback. It's your real self whispering, "This isn't me." But here's the good news. The collapse of the false self isn't a tragedy. It's a portal, a doorway to absolute freedom. Because once you see through the illusion, you can never unsee it. You stop trying to fix yourself because you realize you were never broken. You were just buried under layers of fear, programming, and performance. And as each layer falls away, you don't lose yourself. You find yourself. So ask yourself honestly, what part of your identity is built on fear? What would you have to let go of to be truly free? And what if everything you thought would destroy you, being alone, being misunderstood, being unseen, is the very thing that would liberate you? This is the uncomfortable truth. Aloneness doesn't imprison you. It reveals that you were already imprisoned by your own illusions, and it hands you the key. But no one else can turn it for you. You have to sit in the silence. You have to face what arises. You have to let what was false collapse. And when it does, you don't become less. You become less. You become light. You become peace. You become real. When nothing is left, everything remains. How emptiness becomes the foundation of unshakable joy. There's a moment after the collapse. A strange, quiet moment that doesn't feel like a celebration or a victory. It feels like floating in space. You've let go of the false self. The masks are gone. The performance is over. And the applause has faded. And now, you're sitting in what most people fear more than anything else: emptiness. The silence isn't just around you, it's inside you. The questions you used to ask don't seem to matter anymore. The identity you fought so hard to build no longer feels like it belongs to you. And in that raw stillness, you might think you've lost everything. But stay there. Don't run. Because what you're feeling isn't loss. It's space. And within that space, something miraculous begins to unfold. When nothing is left, everything that truly matters finally has room to arrive. This is one of life's most paradoxical truths. Emptiness is not the absence of meaning, it's the beginning of it. The joy you've been chasing through achievement, relationships, and status has always been elusive because it was trying to land on a crowded stage. You were too full of noise, too full of shoulds, too full of everyone else's expectations. But now, in the aftermath of solitude, when the false self has fallen and the silence has settled, you begin to notice something unexpected: peace. Not the kind that comes from finally getting what you want, but the kind that arises when you realize you don't need it anymore. The kind that doesn't depend on conditions, it just is. And then, slowly, you start to feel joy. Not the ecstatic, fleeting kind that comes from adrenaline. Not the performative kind that exists to be posted or praised, but a deep, warm, steady joy. The joy of being yourself without filters, without apology, without the pressure to be anything else. This joy is different. It doesn't scream. It doesn't need to be noticed. It's quiet, but it's immovable. Because it's not built on anything that can be taken away. It's the joy that comes from finally coming home to yourself. This is why so many spiritual traditions speak of emptiness not as a void, but as fullness. The Buddhists call it sunyata, not nihilism, not despair, but the recognition that clinging to a solid self is the root of suffering. And when you let go of that clinging, when the self evaporates in solitude, what's left is not nothing, it's everything. Infinite possibility. Infinite presence, a vast open awareness that is no longer obsessed with becoming, but content with being. That's what joy really is, The absence of resistance. The absence of resistance. Pretending. The absence of the war within. And from that space, you begin to re-enter the world in a new way. You still live, still work, still love, but you do it from a place of wholeness. You are no longer using people, success, or distraction to fill a hole inside you. The hole is gone. Or rather, it was never a hole to begin with. It was a door. And now that you've walked through it, everything looks different. You're no longer afraid of being alone because you've met the one person you'll always be with, yourself. And you're no longer afraid of losing things because you've already let go of what was false. What remains is real. What remains is unshakable. So let me ask you one final time. What if the emptiness you fear is actually the space where your real life begins? What if everything you thought you needed to hold on to was the very thing blocking your joy? And what if the only thing standing between you and true freedom is your unwillingness to sit in silence and let the false self die? This is the real reason you fear being alone. Not because it will break you down, but because it will break you open. And once you're open, nothing can ever close you again. Nothing to prove, nothing to hide, nothing to chase. Just this moment, just this breath, and finally, just you.